congratulations on the film, Mickey. It's this very eerie, very creepy, kind of nice throwback to like late 70s, early 80s horror, something like Carpenter. I got also some Stephen King, maybe some Carnivals of Soul vibes for some good measure. I don't know. What do you think were some of your inspirations with Offseason?
From a visual standpoint, I mean, yeah, you're kind of hitting it. You know, I definitely, if you notice, like we use some of the songs on the radio from The Fog, and then obviously Carnival of Souls. I love that movie. That's, you know, the dreaminess of it is something that I really enjoyed. But then, you know, from the two jumping off point stories that really were the inception of this film is William Faulkner's A Rose for Emily. Great, a brilliant short story, and then Shirley Jackson's The Summer People. And so those two kind of stories got me thinking and really dreaming about what this movie would ultimately become.
Yeah. What about cinematography? Because you've worked with Mike Fiskin a lot in your career, a number of times actually. And when you're approaching him for your next coming or your upcoming projects or something like that, when you have these idea of horror movies in your head, do you just hand him those, or do you just hand him a stack of maybe other movies that might be tonally different, but visually what you're really going for? What's it like working with Mac?
Yeah, so I mean, this is our sixth movie now, and so my process generally is I draw, and especially for this film, like I drew the entire movie. Like I have hundreds of storyboards with the lighting, and I showed it to him, and then our next step in the process is I'll show him a whole bunch of films. So one of the real cinematic touch points for this movie was Red Desert by Antonioni,
Yeah.
and that's, while it's not the same, still the images of the people in the fog and the loneliness, like that's definitely was one of the touch points. And we knew that we wanted to shoot the movie at certain times of day, very like magic hour, so the whole thing kind of had this twilighty feel to it. And so yeah, every movie's different. I said, I was like, we need mist in every single shot. It was an absolute nightmare for him, but he made it work.
Yeah, every scene is just like absolutely just drenched with fog. I did want to note though that card game behind you, the Cinephile game, you would be a nightmare to play against that game. But
Thank you.
I wanted to ask because I think you've been very open in your career about your inspirations and some of the people that you might want to be inspired by when you're approaching projects where you and I as well see that as a plus of a movie like this. Some people would honestly say that it's a detractor or it's a negative. What would you try to say to maybe convince those people, or do you understand where they're coming from when you hear that criticism? What really goes through your mind?
Well, you know, it's so funny, especially with this movie. I've noticed more on this movie than any of my other films, is that people say that I'm paying homage to movies that honestly I haven't even thought of, and or have seen and never really kind of used as the jumping off point for the movie. So I, you know, at this point, I've kind of like just made my peace with that in some way. Like, no matter what happens, people are going to say that that my movies are a combination of this and this. And so the reality of it is like, you know, if that's how, you know, if you're inspired by God knows what with the thousands of movies they say I ripped off on this one, if that's what you see, I guess, you know, that's the interpretation of art, and everyone's you know, if that inspires you, great.
Yeah. And as you've said, you've taken inspiration from filmmakers like Brian De Palma or Roger Corman with some of your previous works. When you go about making those films and incorporating these different styles, what is something that you try to incorporate into the movies, or remember when you're making the movies, to not make it these kind of flimsy imitations of these other films, but make it also a Mickey Keating movie?
hmm Yeah, well, I think the thing first and foremost that I try to do is, it's never, and especially with this film and probably my last one more so than any one, is that I don't try to say like, okay, now we're gonna do this shot from Blowout. Now we're gonna do this shot from whatever. It's always like, well, I watch these movies and for whatever reason they stayed inside my soul, and I want to be able to try to capture and invoke that feeling again. And so really those are the efforts, more so than being like, okay, today we're going to do Dress to Kill. And definitely with Offseason, that was the case, to try to, the reason why I storyboarded and we did a preemptive cut just on paper was to be able to say, like, when we're shooting, let's get to the basics and let's forget anything that I dreamed of and see what instinctually comes out. And yeah, so I think that's kind of the progress that I want to be able to continue going forward. But honestly, it's hard to say. You kind of shoot instinctually as much as you can and hope that it resonates with people.
Was there anything that, because you also wrote this film as well, when you were writing this film, were there any elements of the movie that you maybe set out initially when you kind of opened that first page on that document on that fateful day? Is there anything that you set out to do that once you actually got invested in these characters and the story that you maybe went, maybe this isn't maybe the story or the style or the mood that I want to go for? Or was it all kind of, did it all just seem to click together?
Yeah, well, this movie kind of went through iterations. And then the first draft of the movie, I always write really fast. And so the first drafts are always like 70 pages long, maybe. And so what I initially set out to do was like almost like this Cassavetes relationship drama in this dead town. And then a nightmare kind of transpires from there. But then as I started drawing it and as I started developing it, like I really, the ticking clock urgency kind of became the most essential thing to it. And so, yeah, I guess the effort was to make it, we pushed ourselves, especially in the edit, to go even more nightmarish and dreamy than I think I even kind of planned from the beginning. But yeah, so it's interesting to see the whole evolution. I have, the first edit that we cut on paper is completely different than the movie that you see.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
it was the first time I'd ever done that.
Well, you talked about dabbling in some other genres there. Are there any other genres that maybe, because you've had a reasonably prolific career, even though you're like a pretty young filmmaker, are there any other genres that you're wanting to play with, or does horror kind of seem like a bit of a comfortable place for you?
Oh yeah, I mean, I love horror. I mean, I always have, and I think that all of my movies will be kind of dark in some way. I don't think you're going to see me ever make a broad comedy, but I really want to do, I am a genre guy. I really want to do crime movies. I really want to do science fiction. I'm working on things like that. But yeah, I think I'll stay anchored in genre. But I would love to make as many horror films as possible, as long as they don't repeat themselves.
Sure. When you go about making some of these horror movies, do you have a specific goal in mind? Some might say, there's this idea out there of like elevated horror. I think it sounds kind of pretentious, but do you try to have a mixture of things to allure the audience, scares, characters, all those types of things, or do you just go in kind of with one set goal and whatever audiences might glean from it, they will?
Yeah, well, the goal is always for me to make something that I would want to see and that I hadn't seen done in that way before. And I think that a huge pitfall of indie filmmaking, especially, is getting movies made is so difficult. And so I always say it's like if I'm gonna be able to make a film, I want it to be something that is satisfying personally and artistically for me, but also isn't some there's so many indie films that are made to be auditions for studio movies, right? Like
Yeah.
they do the studio films with a quarter of the budget and they're just trying to imitate what Jason Blum does best or what a couple of these other people do best. And so that's the effort to try to avoid something. It's like if these movies are going to be made at a certain budget, I'm going to have them be as creatively fulfilling and from my own voice and the voice of my collaborators, more so than trying to audition for Sinister Nine or something. You know what I mean?
Sure, yeah. Well, I was going to
As
ask you
much as I love those movies.
for sure. Well, I was going to ask you about that actually later, that you've had this pretty nice set of films for yourself as an indie filmmaker. Is that something that you're interested in pursuing in the future, these bigger studio filmmakers, or does it depend on the project? If you get approached for those kind of things, is that something that interests you?
Yes, to a degree. So I guess my favorite filmmakers have kind of worked their way up. I probably can almost guarantee you that I won't be the guy who all of a sudden one day you see a Deadline article saying that I'm doing a sequel to X giant,
Sure.
or
Yeah.
mid-level studio film. I want all of the films that I make. Obviously, I of course want to make studio films to get as broad of a distribution as possible. But I love writing and I want to continue to write my own material. And so if it works out that way, I definitely am willing and excited to do so, but I'm not like rushing to kind of
Yeah.
sell my soul.
Uh, could you maybe off the top of your head share any studio notes that you've gotten that are like trying to make it more of a broad appeal that you're like, what are you doing?
Yeah, yeah. Without saying what, I've been hired to do some announced, some not, some studio scripts, and there was one that I had written that I thought was really pretty cool and pretty original. And the first note I got back was, "How can we make it?" First and foremost, it was a science fiction film, and the first note I got back was, "How can we make it more like Scream?" And I was like, "I don't know. I have no idea because I this is completely different."
Yeah.
So that was kind of like a kind of a surprise. But overall, I'm excited by notes and excited by that process because it is this kind of interesting challenge. And I'm willing. There are some filmmakers who don't want to do that, right?
Yeah.
Who don't want to have that fight, but I'm ready.
Yeah. I do want to ask you about your lead actress in this film, Jacqueline Donahue, who's also sort of carving out this really nice place for herself as a bit of an indie scream queen. What is it
Mhm.
about her, not only maybe in this film, but her prior works that you really think audiences are able to identify with, or that she's just a real talent and a presence on screen?
I think that she is. There's just something about her. She is a brilliant actor, but she's not over the top, I suppose. And especially with a film like this, where it could have just been a very overly dramatic, screaming, shrieking kind of character. Anybody, who could have. There could have been a bad version of that, and she kind of anchors it and brings this sort of, her own kind of presence to it. I also think that she definitely has this classic like 60s 70s movie star look that just makes the film look timeless. And
Yeah.
the great thing about her as an actor is that she's willing to kind of take that leap into this kind of nightmare logic surreal, almost like that monologue that she gives in the film. It's like I told her, I was like, you should play this with a sense of embarrassment because it is absurd. You're telling an absurd story, and she was able to bring such a humanity to that. So I hope that she should be a great big movie star, and I really hope that she becomes one sooner than later.
Yeah. Just one look at your film credits. As I said, you've been doing this for a little bit now, and you continue to crank out these projects pretty quickly, surprisingly quickly. What is something that when you look forward to the next project, what is something that about the filmmaking process that you're excited to work on?
Definitely, as if a movie is something that is tonally completely different than what I've previously worked on, that's really exciting for me. And all I do is watch movies. Like it's been my life for my whole life. And so if I find something that it's like that inspires me in a completely different way from what I'm working on or have worked on, that just gives me all the life to continue. And so I have so many movies that I want to make that I probably never will. And so yeah, it really just is the effort to keep that flame going with the love of cinema, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah. What about the opposite side when you're looking at the next project? What's maybe an element of it that you're not so excited for?
Oh, begging for the money to do it. Trying to get actors on board who will sell the film. It's every single thing. It's like pre-production is the worst, and when the movie's about to come out and hoping that people respond to it. Those two parts of the process are like they give me chest pains for sure.
Sure. Well, do you think that's maybe a key to you getting a lot of these projects off the ground, is that you do have this strong sense of inspiration from other filmmakers, that when you're pitching it to studio execs, you're able to say those kind of the hot button words like, it's John Carpenter inspired or something like that. Do you find that that helps you a little bit?
It definitely gets me out of jams, like because I'm able to be, if I can't think of where the script's going to go, it's really easy to turn on a whole bunch of movies and get some guidance from the masters. In terms of studio things, the thing that I'm not going to be cynical drag, Hollywood's a drag, but I found that a lot of executives don't really like or watch very many movies. And if
Yeah.
you say the movie like say, oh, I want to do something like The Thing, a lot of people kind of associate the thing, even though it's a classic now, it was a total flop when it came out.
Yeah.
So you kind of see either, there are some great executives, but you see a lot of, generally it's like you'll reference a movie and they won't even know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, as I mentioned, Mickey, you are a pretty young filmmaker considered with some of your peers, and you've had this pretty wide breadth of films that you've made so far. I want to know, what did even younger Mickey look like when you were like a teenager or even a kid? When did this love of movies, when you're actually like getting a camera and starting to film your friends or something like that, what did that look like for a young Mickey Keating?
Yeah, I mean, we were just like a whole bunch of little kids running around our Florida neighborhoods, shooting. I have like dozens and dozens and dozens of little horror movies that I made and edited on iMovie. And yeah, I mean, it's generally, truth be told, it's been pretty much the same process going. You know, you could kind of, no one will ever see those movies, but they're definitely. It feels like I'm doing the same thing now. I'm just more stressed out about bigger budgets and making sure that it was so easy and nice to be able to go and shoot a slasher movie on a video camera and not have to worry about anything. Now
Yeah.
it's a little bit more complicated.
Sure. What are some of those? Do you notice any like narrative similarities that you have still kind of in common with yourself, or has nothing really changed?
Well, I mean, I'm still ripping off the Twilight Zone a lot. I mean, that kind of, I think at a very early age, I started to really I don't know why, but to just gravitate towards the original Twilight Zone so dramatically. And so the idea of characters just getting into an extraordinary situation and talking about it has been a kind of a through line throughout my storied career.
Yeah. Well, I've also noticed that you are taking some ventures into some other projects. You have a television show with Shudder that was, yeah, horror themed, but it was kind of something different for you. Is that something that you're interested in more and branching out on these other areas, or is filmmaking and horror kind of what you're wanting to stick with?
Yeah, well, it's so funny. The core was it was so interesting because it was one of those scenarios. I'm very cynical and I don't really kind of expect projects to happen. And I think that's probably why I've made so many, because I always believe that they're never going to come to be. And so I love talking to directors. I love being able to learn from directors. And so when Shutter reached out and they were like, would you want to do this? I was like, yeah, sure, if it ever happens. And
Mhm.
then when it kind of came to fruition, I mean, I wasn't writing it or producing it. That was a guy named Gabe Roth and another guy named Bridger Nielsen. They kind of formulated the whole thing. But it was just such a thrill. And it really came at a time where, I had made so many movies so quickly. So to be able to sit down with someone like Mary Harron or Lee Wanell and talk about movies and what inspires them, it was really exhilarating. And so it was a great thing to do. And then when we were cutting Offseason, I sent Mary a cut of the movie and I asked for her input. And so it was a really, really valuable thing. And I hope that people still like it. It only had one season, but people seem to be digging it.
Well, Mickey, if people want to find out more about this movie, where can they find more information? Because I noticed that you're not on Twitter. Is there a particular reason that you're not on Twitter?
Yeah. I mean, I was never good at Twitter, and then a couple years ago, 5 years, 3 years ago, I don't remember. I was just like, I can't. I'm useless here, and
Yeah.
so people can find out more. Jocelyn has Twitter. Everyone else seems to, and so or just. I have an Instagram that I post little pictures of on the Instagram stories from time to time, so you can check
Sure.
that out.
Well, Mickey Keating, again, congratulations on this film. I really did enjoy it, and I hope you had a wonderful South by Southwest.
Thank you. You too. I really appreciate it.